This video is going to talk about some of the reasons that could be causing the shifter on a Polaris Sportsman to be loose and sloppy feeling. This particular bike is a 2004 Polaris Sportsman 600 Twin, but I'm sure it would apply to many other Sportsmans. On this bike here, you can see that the shifter is very sloppy feeling. It'll move all the way from park up to high gear with almost no indication that you're in a particular gear. Here you can see one of the main causes for the sloppy shifter. This mount is two identical pieces bolted together. Each side is about $8 from Polaris. The other end of the shift rod attaches to the bell crank, and the bell crank attaches to some sort of shift shaft that disappears inside this housing, which I'll show you in a bit. Some people on the forums have said that the bell crank could be a cause of the sloppy shifter, but in this case I don't see how it would be, because there's a nut that attaches the shift shaft to that bell crank, and as long as you have it tightened down pretty hard, it's not going to play around on you. You'll also notice that the bell crank can move back and forth just a little bit. That's attached to the gears inside the transmission. And I think it's just the play between the different teeths on whatever gears are inside that transmission, and I don't think you can fix this. And again, it's not that bad, so in this case I just left that as well. You'll also notice that at each end of the shift rod there is a ball joint type of thing. There's lots of play in both ends on mine, but I don't think it has a huge impact on the sloppy shifter feeling, and at $50 or $60 for the shift rod, I just let it be in this case. Here you'll see the bell crank after I took it off the shift shaft. You'll notice that there is one tooth a lot larger than the others, and that meets up with a larger tooth on the shift shaft, so that you can only put it on one way, which is great, so you don't have to worry about marking the teeth and worrying about putting it on wrong. There's only one way it can go back on. And furthermore, once you'll see later, once I pull off this housing and pull off that shift shaft, it too can only go back in one way and meets up with the gearing inside in only one way, so you don't have to worry about that either. I'm now going to open things up a little bit more so I can see inside and find out why there's no notch in between each gear. First, you're going to need to take off this bell crank. You only need to take off the lower bolt. You don't have to worry about the upper one. Then you need to take off that black circular device, which I believe is the gear indicator, which shows you which gear you're in. There's a little C-clamp right in the center of it. It pops off very easily, and then that'll just slide right off that shaft. And then you can have access to all 5 of the bolts that hold on that housing. Once you get all that stuff off, you'll have to break that housing loose. It's on there with some sort of silicone gasket, so it's a little bit stuck on there. It's a pretty tricky spot to get a hammer in there directly, so what I did was just grab a pry bar, which slipped in behind the frame pretty easily, and I tapped it loose. The housing is some sort of soft looking aluminum alloy, so you don't want to go at this too hard. Just be gentle and it'll come loose. With this cover off, you can see this nasty surprise of rust and gunk. Obviously there was a water leak somehow around the gasket, which allowed everything to get nice and rusty inside. I don't think it's too big of a concern. This little compartment is separate from the actual transmission, so I'm just going to clean it all off the best I can with some engine degreaser and a wire brush, and then inspect things further. This, where the arrow's pointing, this is the detent pawl, is what Polaris calls it. Some of the forums said that this could also be an issue. However, after I cleaned all mine off, there wasn't anything wrong with it. But it was missing a spring, which I will point out to you in a second. And I've discovered that in fact is the problem that's causing there to be no notch feeling in between each gear. I don't know why it's not in there, but somehow it's not. I guess the last person must have just taken it out or forgot to put it in. Here's the spring that was missing. It was $8 from Polaris. I don't know why it wouldn't be in there to begin with. I assume the previous owner maybe got frustrated with how difficult Polaris Sportsmans can be to shift sometimes, so removed it completely so that there'd be absolutely no notch in between gears. I'll just put it in its place right now so you can see where it goes, and then you'll see it assembled together in a minute. Here's the back side of that cover plate. Now that I've cleaned it up, you're able to see the detent pawl a little bit more clearly. This spring just puts upward pressure on it, which pushes it into different notches on a gear inside that compartment, which allows you to feel the different notches in between gears. You can see that without that spring, that detent pawl lever would just hang down below and not even come into play with the gear that it's supposed to sit up against. It's now somewhat back together. You can see that shiny new spring down there at the bottom. I had to pull that shift shaft and the detent pawl off of that cover plate in order to reassemble it properly. The spring goes in quite easily. It was going to be pretty tight and put a lot of pressure on that detent pawl, and I didn't want that hard of a shift, so what I did was actually squeeze that spring together in a vise to make it a little bit shorter. And now there should be a good amount of pressure on that spring without it being too hard to shift. Checked with the mechanic at the Polaris dealership. He recommended using some white lithium grease and just spray it inside there. I didn't have any of that, and I thought it might be a little bit too light for this application, so I just used some all-purpose grease. It might not be the right choice, but anything's a step better compared to what it was before. Okay, so everything's back together now. You can see that blue sealant squeezing out from between the seams. It's just a basic silicone liquid gasket. I used a gasket scraper and some degreaser to make sure the mating surfaces were nice and clean. What you choose for a gasket or sealant for this application isn't too important. It really only needs to just keep water out. It's not like something with high pressure such as a head gasket, so any common sense product you use should be fine. So in the end, your problem might not be identical to mine, but you can see there's various reasons why a shifter on a Polaris Sportsman could be loose. It could be that upper mount that is very loose like mine was. It could be the shift rod bushings. It could be that detent pawl inside is worn out and sloppy as well. It could be that bell crank that has some rounded off teeth. Or you could be missing a spring just like I did, or that spring could be worn out, full of gunk and grime, and just not putting any pressure on that detent pawl anymore. Hope this helps. Good luck.